Last year, I submitted a comment to the Commodities Future Trading Commission on January 20th. I submitted another one on January 27th. I'm going to read them both, but first let me just preface this by saying that one of them was used in an act of illegal coinage. I saw exactly what that coinage was about. I found the bill later. I'm sorry if you're disappointed that what you were trying to do is use an old act of illegal coinage involving a minor as part of a process to roll it over to a new minor. And somebody prevented you from being able to do that successfully. And now you're possibly in a uncomfortable position because you got caught in the act of illegal coinage involving minors. I'm also not sorry at all. January 20th of 2020 was, if I'm not mistaken, just this past week, connected to a transition in the executive of the United States of America. January 27th will be 7 days later. This is comment number 62279. Having distinct categories for classification, along with appropriate certification of validity to engage transactional processes connected to those classification levels, needs to be regarded profoundly. The processes of bundling transactional processes have been used for years to launder money and have not been anything close to adequately addressed within the U.S. Insofar as it is understood that in 2018, the Board of Exchange permitted the trade of cryptocurrencies without needing to be licensed, one has to address what the implications are now and in the future. I have for several years attempted to bring attention to the use of derivative agreements that have lacked appropriate disclosure, consent, and grounding prior to engagement in trade. To subject someone who is not a licensed broker or trader, or who does not have access to licensed brokers or traders, to derivative agreements as part of transactional processes being leveraged by others who do, is not only in violation of basic contract law concerning intent and disclosure upon inception of the contract, but also has the potential to subject those involved in the derivative applications to levels of risk that were not appropriately covered beforehand and are inaccurately assessed in terms of liability. A serious problem, especially in regards to public financing, is the inappropriate mixing of assets between different departments or sectors that have different levels of exposure to what is defined as toxicity, but what can also be a way to either write off a fine for being convicted of illegal activity or an attempt to cover up for the actually illegal transactions using the camouflage of what else is bundled onto the transaction. If one attempts to be fastidious in assuring that such toxicity is not permitted to pass through undetected and forestalled from clearing, then the rest of that which is processed together with it has the potential of being shut down or, by association, impacted in a manner that should not even be possible. It is also more difficult to appropriately define the problem and provide a possibility for recharacterization without more specificity. This has the potential to waste a lot of actual value and to allow a completely inaccurate and potentially inflated valuation of something that should otherwise not be permitted to process. If by disaggregation what is meant is a process by which specific categorization streams can be assigned so as to assure that there is not a mixing of assets that have different levels of necessary security inherent in their processing, then this can be a positive development. The question, however, arises at the point of considering the data to be made available for a specific type of aggregation beforehand and what is made available during the time frame in which it is aggregated. If the distinction regarding what sort of data streams or transactional processes are appropriate for aggregation are not addressed appropriately, then disaggregation presents a possibility for laundering assets past a determinate point or being leveraged with a misvaluation. This leaves open possibilities for those intending to defraud to escape accountability, and others who are not actually the providers of the value under consideration to be availed of merits or penalties they do not deserve. A word of caution. Failure to establish and define limits in regards to speculation, especially in derivatives, always runs the risk that the one who believes they have control over the assessment of the transaction are going to engage or be engaged at a level of risk they have not adequately covered. Indeed, a great deal of the current liability that is attempted for leveraging is directly connected to mischaracterizations in the beginning or another later stage of the transactional process, and hence the speculation is potentially accounted for at one level of risk that actually masks the true risk inherent in the transaction. You can try to downgrade a person in such processes, especially if they have been denied the means to acquire confirmation of their actual level of participation, valuation, and be compensated and taxed accordingly. You can write off your own liability or taxes onto someone downgraded and dispossessed of the means to participate financially at the level of cognizance and capability for which they are otherwise qualified. But explicit acknowledgement of consciousness of the components of the aggregate negates the inherent default verbal contract terms if it is revealed that an act of downgrading is done so as to attempt to cover up for using that person or their assets to launder money or assets in connection with processes for which the other person is not otherwise qualified. Even if it is not formally acknowledged at the moment at which one attempts to confirm the transaction, this accrues as a liability. An appropriate accounting of these processes is also part of any possible speculation. This was submitted at 11:07 a.m. on January 20th, 2020. Now, the next one was submitted, and it was given a comment number, and it just so happened that the comment number ends in the same metric I have been attempting to challenge in association with a very specific aspect of this pattern of racketeering activity I've been attempting to have addressed through the court system and also in connection with my reports to people who have been in public office and would otherwise be in a role to be able to address these matters. This is comment number 62288. I'm going to read it as is, and then I'm going to give the explication of what I understood happened with this public comment. Your request for public comment describes an intent to implement a procedure to confirm the accuracy of swap data with both counterparties to a swap. The first thing necessary in order to do this effectively is to acquire the informed consent of both counterparties from the onset. We have now had more than 10 years of swap deals using futures contracts that also include ones that were originally some other form of agreement to which a participant consented at the time. For someone to then take this agreement, sell it even after anonymization, and use it for other purposes is not obtaining and engaging processes with informed consent. I say this with the disclosure that today is 10 days after 6 months following a report to the Senate Armed Forces Committee concerning the Army Futures Command. That the deadline for this request for public comment ends today is no coincidence. I am concerned that the Army Futures Command uses derivative agreements and swaps, including connected to real-time reporting via derivative, that without informed consent and appropriate determination and calibration can engage concurrent transactions at levels of risk that are inappropriate and unsafe. There is no excuse that should be permitted for allowing an organization to engage in such practices, even those alleging to do so under the rubric of national security or national defense. In fact, using derivative agreements with what might otherwise be completely civilian entities in order to launder or disguise asset diversion for military or alleged national security purposes undermines domestic security and provides a serious misrepresentation of the actual value and security present within the U.S. and in regards to others with whom the U.S. engages in commercial activities. This is important in specific regards to what is discussed as part of the information presented on the intention behind attempting to acquire these public comments. A major question emerges as to how much of the data that was acquired prior to the implementation date of the rules of concern is going to be available for swap. Historical references and contextualization can also include information that was previously accessible under other terms, previously characterized as confidential, or in some cases, public information that was later defined as confidential, or otherwise assessed value. This includes use value, insofar as certain market participants made available data to which they had access in manners that may have effectively recharacterized it, contrary to the manners in which it was originally offered. A lot of what was previously characterized, for instance, for one person as debt was used as leverage by another person without appropriate information about the actual potential value or the comprehensive consideration of terms of the original offer. The actual full potential value of and risk associated with that data, depending upon its potential uses, were undisclosed at the time the obligation was incurred or the relationship initiated. This has serious implications that cannot be ignored. Conversely, much of what was previously offered as reports on fraud and malfeasance was recharacterized as policy updates without appropriate closeout reports, prosecution for attendant crimes or restitution, or damage recovery for and acknowledgement of the reporters or the victims. This can impact other financial instruments backing the agencies to which those reports were initially filed. The damage recovery mentioned herein is not just about civil penalties and or monetary compensation, but can also include defamation of character, obstruction of other forms of market participation that might have been beneficial both personally and socially, and a deficit in terms of demonstrable value in implementing law enforcement or regulatory compliance measures, which in turn supports further efforts to prevent recurrences of fraud and other crimes. This deficit has domestic and international ramifications, especially if a swap is being conducted with entities that are beholden to other jurisdictional requirements concerning anti-money laundering efforts or have themselves been targeted or sanctioned regarding allegations of financial impropriety. Considerations regarding use of technology by comparable market participants should be made accordingly. Indeed, this is where it becomes even more pertinent to assure that there is informed consent and prior disclosure in terms of the potential derivative uses for which one's data is used. Efficiency should not preclude conscientious application of necessary safety and security measures. One specific point to address is the proposed changes to the term commercial, using specifying to perform its regulatory responsibilities. This change can be potentially applied in manners that make available the process by which the regulatory participant is acquiring information to assess compliance for parsing out to, selectively pass component information on, or to adjust the characterization in the process, as if negotiating a characterization. If one considers this relative to the means by which such data is reported, then the possibility for hacking increases. So too does the possibility for fraud. Specificity in regards to any use of a swap needs to be established and maintained as a standard so as to prevent against its potential abuse. Confirmation of acceptance needs to be explicit and verifiable. Prosecution for abuses of these matters is essential to assure the long-term viability of such activities. This was submitted at 11:25 a.m. Central Standard Time on January 27, 2020. Now, I put a note after I put it into the body. I typed it up and then I put it into the body. I typed it and then I copied and pasted it and put it into the body of the form. And then after I put it into the body of the form, I added, please note that again, I had to re-enter the validation code a second time, just as I did the last time. I attempted a public comment for this agency. This lets me know that my accounts and efforts at a public comment are indeed being proxied. I will not accept the second time, but will try for a third. Now, the truth is that the version of the report that the Army Futures Command submitted says that it was being presented before the Small Business Administration, or the Small Business Committee and that Senator Cardine from Maryland was the person in charge and was the person to whom it was directly addressed. My problem with that report is that in the report it discusses how the Army Futures Command is going to be rolling out a process whereby it was going to be engaging more comprehensively with small businesses around national security support. But when asked directly how they intended to keep track of the progress of the activities they were engaging with these small businesses, they said that at that time they had no process by which they were going to do this or to execute this, and they did not have any intention of implementing a process in order to track the success or the accountability of their engagements with small businesses. Now, I know from my other research in these matters that going back for 15 years before this report was submitted, that there are very specific processes that the Department of Defense and agencies within the Department of Defense are required to adhere to in order to track the effectiveness and the efficiency of contractors with the Department of Defense. The question then becomes, under what jurisdiction does the Army Futures Command think it's operating if it does not require to state formally and on the record at a time frame where it is putting into effect this kind of a policy exactly what the standards are to which it is going to adhere in determining its accountability, both with the individuals or the individual persons in the form of small businesses they're working with, or with the various departments and or the various agencies within the federal government that they're going to be intersecting with in performance of their duties. It doesn't seem to make any sense that they would be allowed to make that presentation to the Senate and to the Congress and get away with it. They should not have been allowed to move forward on any activities until they answered that question. And by the way, there is a variety of precedent that has already been established by other agencies and other departments within the military about how it is supposed to account for its relationship with contractors. Now, is there perhaps a problem in the fact that once this was printed, it said the Senate Armed Forces Committee, as opposed to saying the Small Business Committee or the Committee on Small Businesses? Is this something that I made a mistake in regards to? Or was it something that ended up in the actual text of the comment once it got published after I had to resubmit it? Because they were real time swapping me. They were real time swapping me for what? Performance with the Senate Armed Forces Committee? Well, let's bring up the other matters that were ongoing at this time that I knew about when I submitted this comment, which is that in November of 2019, there had been emergency appropriations that prioritized the HHS and the Department and the DHS, Health and Human Services, and the Department of Health of Homeland Security, were put into an emergency appropriations measure that at the time did not make much sense to me. Because at the time, even though they were discussing matters related to the federal budget's relationship to the attended impeachment process of Donald Trump, the actual appropriations process and this emergency appropriations bill outside of a particular kind of contextualization did not make sense. That came later. That came later when I found what was the president's budget priorities for the Department of Defense for what was supposed to be the fiscal year that emergency appropriations bill was speaking to. And specifically, mentioned in that emergency appropriations bill was a deadline connected to March 15th of 2019. Well, for those of us that were following COVID-19, what happened on March 16th of 2020? What happened on March 16th of 2020? A lot of places, including the state of Texas, declared their official COVID emergency, shut down public buildings, remanded people to their homes, implemented social distancing and mandatory masking under the auspices of responding to an emergency situation connected to a health pandemic. But meanwhile, I believe and now understand that emergency appropriations bill was an effort to usurp the capacity for the Department of Defense to effectively provide support in a already understood process connected to what would be an appropriate military role in responding to a domestic pandemic effort. If there was actually a response to a national emergency in the United States connected to a health pandemic that also correlates with considerations of potential for exploitation in commission of acts of domestic terrorism and or aiding and abetting international acts of domestic terrorism and or exposing us to a greater risk that those that have malign intent against our country might use that as an opportunity to visit some sort of military action against us. That was not addressed in anything close to that manner. Why did we have to wait until the swearing in of somebody that was elected under completely dubious circumstances at best to have the kind of mobilization of the National Guard that we had recently? Again, it was blamed on people within the United States engaged in civil unrest. Well, there was already an appropriate protocol for engaging the National Guard in response to COVID-19. They didn't do anything attendant with or in accordance with what would be considered an appropriate response to a health pandemic. What did happen? What did happen when it came to Small Business Administration within this country during COVID-19? Did anybody see any differences to the actual contracts that were allowed to be awarded to the Department of Defense in the last year? Or did nobody say anything about that because nobody said anything about the contract awards the year before while they were campaigning and stubbing for green energy? That's exactly the kind of thing that is being got at here. If we are in a situation where securities associated with Department of Defense appropriations are the kind that are substantial and high quality enough that it's understood that they can be made available for some sort of support financial activities in other sectors of the economy and or in connection with other kinds of appropriations, that's one thing. But what I contend has been happening is that since at least 2009, that there have been acts of laundering through the Department of State instead of applying an appropriate accountability mechanism within the Department of Defense. And that was after a 10-year process whereby the Department of Defense was intentionally undermined in consideration of alleged intelligence activities that came at the behest of a presidential specification that was questioned by members of the intelligence community before September 11, 2001. Well, where did that come from? Well, I mean, we did have a substantial 10-year period of time before that when the credibility of the military was challenged based upon a refusal to implement and adhere to appropriate standards around accountability concerning our foreign activities abroad. That gets back to, well, who's making the actual money? When you decrease and depress the standards to which the military is held accountable to, and yet still allow for billions, if not trillions of dollars worth of obligation to be meted out every year under that department, what sense does it make to not maintain the highest standard of accountability and performance and still allow for so much obligation to be incurred? That is what gets ultimately to the essence of what they were actually doing in the fall of 2019 during the time frame in which the material conditions for supporting COVID-19 were being orchestrated in this country. And then, once we answer those questions, we can talk about this illegal coinage situation and then talk about the executive order nobody's talked about regarding the mandate concerning immunizations that was passed in September of 2019 and was intentionally allowed to default last spring when we were supposed to be getting a report in that discussed the success. And rather than doing that, what was happening? Well, somebody was engaged in high level, high risk speculation on who was going to be able to command the market share regarding contract awards for COVID relief. And there was a difference of opinion that was completely outside of the appropriate jurisdiction for what we're really dealing with.